Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about the Dwarves in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. The Dwarves are easily one of the worst races in the game at the moment. They're not quite on the same level as Nurgle or Daniel, the Demon Prince, or the Empire, or a couple of other races, but they are certainly one of the weaker races and one of the worst design races for Warhammer 3. They weren't quite so bad in Warhammer 2, but now Warhammer 3, with its map design and gameplay changes, certainly has hurt the Dwarves in a significant fashion. What is one of the biggest issues? Well, it's the map itself. Like, I've been playing the Old World mod. That makes for a much better Dwarven experience. But why is that such a difference? Well, let's take Forgrim's campaign over here. I start with Karazakarak, tier 1 settlement. I start with the barracks. And I start with an army right outside the settlement. Easily something to auto-resolve. And you usually want to get Gorog. You want to drink to victory over here at the start. Because the post-battle loot you're going to get as the Dwarves in a vast number of situations is going to be pretty bad. In point of fact, the amount of money you're getting from post-battle loot, in many cases, even when dealing with full stacks, is really pathetic. One of the main reasons you would actually go for post-battle loot for execute and loot would be for the oath gold. But here's the thing, with regards to post-battle loot. The post-battle loot I get for dealing with a garrison containing this many units is 99. That is genuinely one of the most pathetic amounts that you can earn post-battle in the game. Now, the amount of money I would gain from sacking the settlement is decent enough, might seem decent enough, but the problem is there are races in the game that do significantly better with respect to this. Now, you might say, well, not all races should be the same. Well, the problem is, we're all dealing with the same map in the campaign. That doesn't change. We have a campaign map, if we just look at it very quickly. We have a campaign map where, with a couple of exceptions, like, say, certain areas of Darklands, or certain mountain ranges which are difficult to cross, but the vast majority of territories, the vast majority of the map, contains regions, settlements, that can easily be reached between 1 to 2 turns. That's the norm of Warhammer 3. And what this means is that races can really take advantage of going to a settlement, sacking it, or occupying and loot it if you don't want to reduce its level. Because remember, sacking a settlement will reduce its level by 1, and occupying it by further 1. So if you just occupy and loot the settlement, you'll only reduce it by 1 as opposed to 2. So some things to take into consideration over there. What this means is, because the Dwarves have bad post-battle loot, like greenskins may have earned easily doubled in that, and that's just the start, because once you get going into a campaign with research, with ancillaries, it gets much higher than that. I've been able to sack well over 10,000 gold from certain settlements on the campaign map playing greenskin campaigns. And it's not just greenskin campaigns. With the Dwarves, you will genuinely struggle to get over 1,000. And honestly, the Pillars of Grumni over here in this case was actually a good example, because I've seen many situations where you can get 100, 200, or even far lower. What this means is, the Dwarves, who in theory have a decent enough economy, actually end up significantly falling behind compared to other races. And that is a problem, because it means that you have weaker economy, you don't have that many buildings, you don't have that many armies compared to other races. Like, from a theoretical standpoint, the Dwarves should have one of the stronger economies in the game, because they earn a lot of money. They do earn a decent amount of money through settlement income, though it's certainly not the best economy, but it should be, let's say, weaker than the High Elves, but still fairly decent enough. Like, your basic economic structure costs 1,000 and generates 200, and it goes all the way to 600. which is fairly decent enough. The cost of 1,000 for 200 is not the best in the game, though it's certainly a lot better than, say, Kislev or many other demonic races. But what makes the dwarf economy great is not this toolmaker building chain. In fact, the toolmaker would be pretty terrible in quite a few ways. Not the worst, but not that great. But here's the thing. The dwarves can generate production resources, and they can trade. So because of this fact, they can earn a decent amount of money. This is one of the reasons why the High Elves end up being so dominant on the campaign map economically, because they produce trade resources, which will sell. And on top of that, they also increase the amount of tradable resources produced faction-wide, and also increase your income from trade tariffs with every trading depot. It's basically a lesser version of the High Elves. But here's the difference. The High Elves can actually earn a lot more money from post-battle loot than the Dwarves do. And that is a problem. I have seen with the Old World mod, and even going back and playing Warhammer 1 and 2, how simply spacing out settlements more means the Dwarves are less awful compared to their peers. Simply because it means in those kind of situations, you don't have this sacking economy that is fueling a lot of the stronger races in the game at the moment. Though it should be pointed out that while Creative Assembly designing a different map than they ultimately did for Immortal Empires and even Realms of Chaos, because it's not like the Realms of Chaos map is that different or that spaced out in terms of settlements. I think there was the decision for Creative Assembly. They specifically decided to put settlements fairly close to each other in Warhammer 3. I think the intent behind this was to push people into fighting those siege battles, minor settlement battles, which they probably put a lot of time, effort, and energy into designing, and they ended up being pretty bad to ultimately play. So, bad design decisions that ultimately came to a head. Now, the economic situation is a problem, but it gets worse with respect to the dwarves. Now, the dwarves can be improved in certain ways. There are mods that I strongly recommend. The Unforgotten Dwarfs mod, which is available on Steam, does make the situation substantially better for them, and it's just a stat mod. Like, it's just a mod that changes a couple of things, adds a couple of skills, but makes the dwarves significantly better. The second problem for the dwarves is they earn less money from sacking settlements, they earn less post-battle loot than many other factions, but they have incredibly expensive structures. Like, let's look at Karazak Iraq. To get it to tier 2, it's 2,500. And this is the same cost as a regular building. So this means that as the dwarves, you have less money than other people, and other things may cost more. Or they cost the same as some other factions, but you just have less resources. So this ultimately makes the dwarves far slower to progress on the campaign map. And this is the problem, because the name of the game in Immortal Empires is really that early game aggression. Again, it's a question of map design really hurting certain races like dwarves. As I have stated, Warhammer 1, Warhammer 2 to a lesser extent, but still there, and the Old World mod that's currently available in a beta for Warhammer 3 do not have this kind of issue, because you have the settlements more spaced out than what CA did for Immortal Empires. Now, if you're thinking that CA couldn't have made the map more spaced out, you would be wrong. It is very possible to get the map running pretty decently well with more spaced out settlements and even more factions than what CA ended up doing. In fact, it is possible to make the map significantly larger than this, and people have proven that that is actually the case. So it was a deliberate decision on their part to make everything so close together to one another. Now, I imagine there were several reasons behind that, quest objectives, if you will, victory conditions, etc., but still not a great state of affairs. The other problem for the dwarves is they have genuinely the worst growth in the entire game. Whereas Bretonnia is a race with a weak roster, especially infantry, that gets by because they have an incredible economy. Like, look at Bretonia. Bretonia has an incredible economy, good casualty replenishment, and they earn a lot of money from sacking and looting settlements. The dwarves are the exact opposite. They have a powerful army, sure, but they have horrible casualty replenishment, which I'll get into in just a second, the worst growth in the game, and an economy that on the surface level might seem decent, but doesn't end up actually being that great, because you'll be spending a lot of the money you will earn. So basically, like, a tier 1 dwarf settlement gives you 5 growth. A tier 2, 7, and it goes up to 10. This is genuinely the most pathetic growth in the game. And growth is important because because growing your settlements to a higher level as quickly as possible is crucial towards your empire viability. It means more building slots. And since the dwarf economy is reliant on 3 different buildings, and that's just the economy, let alone things like hero capacity, unit recruitment, all that kind of stuff, or landmarks and special resources, it ends up in a situation where the dwarf campaign is even slower. So you already have a race that earns less money from battles than many others do, and you also have a race that is going to be constrained because of the growth. Now, there are some ways to improve it, but just keep in mind that you're playing catch up with this. And even with the methods that are available for the dwarves to improve their economic situation, it is still not as great, nowhere near as great as to what some other races can do. Now, there are certain lords that you can recruit. I'm not sure if I have any right here. No, I do not. But there is the ability of reducing the construction cost. But here's the thing. That is a particular trait, and there are others that you may want to get. And you can also get Mason, that reduces the construction cost for provincial capitals and settlement buildings. Now, you can reduce it by quite a bit, but it is a hassle. And you compare it to the Greenskins, you compare it to the Skaven, you compare it to other races. Yes, some other races may end up matching the cost of the dwarves later on for buildings, but early on, when they're building up a province to, say, tier 3, things end up being significantly cheaper compared to what the dwarves have to deal with. Then, there's the research tree. This is a bloated mess. Like, consider this situation. A normal research tree, you would have something like loyalty and high king authority combined, because what's the point in researching the same thing twice? There are certainly some things that are worth it, like autonomy of the holds or toolmaker. And this is, by the way, what the solution is to growth. You have a commandment that gives you 15 growth. You can increase it to 30. You can also get 10 extra growth. So you can get 40 growth through a commandment. I want to point out that the Greenskins get, 30 growth faction-wide if they have a high WA level. And on top of that, the Greenskins have a commandment that also gives them growth. And their main settlement buildings give them significantly higher growth. Then there is the issue of the grudges. Oh boy, that is quite annoying. But looking back at the research tree, there is never, ever any reason in a campaign to do anything different than this. You get autonomy of the holds, because it helps you make up for a lot of the issues. And then, since you're at it, you might as well get High King Authority. Because that control and diplomatic relations, but the control is going to help with the growth in particular. And then you either get heavy cornstones, which will improve your economy by just a very tiny amount, but you get heavy cornstones, so you're spending 34 turns just to get some control in your faction and to improve some commandments, as well as improve your economy a bit. Once you're done with that, in 34 turns, so you can do it faster, but once you're done with that, the best thing to do in a campaign is get ammunition wagons and then get volley fire. That's an additional 12 turns, and since you're here anyway, you should pick up all of these things. Which each of these will take a couple of turns to do. So Master Crossbows will take 3 turns. Renowned Deadeyes will take 3 turns as well. And Superior Black Powder will take 5. So you're adding You're adding an additional 11 turns. So 34 with 12, 46, 57 turns. By that point, your campaign is effectively over. Now, if you get all of this done, what you then do is you recite Ancient Grudges, which will take a whopping 50 fucking turns. And the only reason you're getting recite Ancient Grudges is to actually get that casualty replenishment capacity and the local recruitment capacity to +2. Because this is another issue of the dwarves. Their unit recruitment capability is, again, one of the worst in the game. Skaven, Greenskins, others may increase their unit recruitment capacity with every settlement they take. Dwarves don't. The only ways to increase unit recruitment capacity, local recruitment capacity, is either skill sets for legendary lords, or to get a research, or to get a certain building. But keep in mind what I mentioned about the economic situation of the dwarves and their growth situation. You're going to have limited building slots, and you have different buildings that you want to get during the course of a campaign. The building that increases local recruitment capacity is the armory. It also increases your runesmith capacity, and you generally want to get it because getting the Gromnil Forge in a provincial capital is useful, but at the same time, it just isn't the kind of building you're going to spam every province, and it's 4,000 gold. Now, this is not necessarily unique to the dwarves having an expensive building like this, but it is the only way to increase their local recruitment capacity beyond getting a high-level research. There's also commandment that increases your unit recruitment capacity, but typically speaking, it's not worth getting that versus growth unless you really want to recruit an army in a very fast fashion. Also, with all those limitations, it's not like dwarf units are the cheapest in the game. So you will end up fielding far fewer armies in your campaign as a result of this. While certainly dwarf warriors may seem reasonable, I want to point out that if you're playing a dwarf campaign, what you want to get are quarrelers during the course of that particular campaign. Then there is the issue of the grudges. The grudges are a pure fucking misery, to express myself in the most blunt possible fashion. Let's say you get a faction entering your territory, raiding it. It can be a turn, doesn't matter. You then get a grudge not to raid that particular faction, because if it was that particular faction that raided you, it would be removed if you eliminated that faction. So let's say a minor greenskin faction like these guys raids me. Well, I'm then going to get a grudge against all greenskins to raid them. Now, it might not seem too much of an issue, but you can't just switch to raid stats, do it instantly, and then move on. No, you have to wait a turn. So you have to spend a turn in enemy territory raiding another faction when you can take their territory very quickly. It is such a waste of fucking time, and it is a genuine freaking annoyance to deal with. Like, in this situation, let's say, the Bloody Spears were to raid me, then I would have to waste a fucking turn when I've got Skarsnik, Clan Rectus, and Warzak bearing down my throat. I do not have the time, luxury, or ability to waste my time dealing with this. So the grudge meter sucks in a lot of ways. It was far worse when Immortal Empires launched. Now, the reason the grudge meter is so important is because the dwarves, as I stated, have low growth, and they have high construction costs. So keeping a low grudge level may be one of the things that helps you out in a campaign. The relevant aspect here with regards to control is that a high level of control will give you a bit of growth, whereas a low level of control will reduce your growth. It is in fact very easy and possible with the dwarves playing on the default settings. With the public order modifier that you get on Legendary, I have a mod that disables that. I'd strongly recommend playing with that mod if you're playing as the dwarves. But by default, it is very easy for the dwarves to lose a high level of control and be in a negative growth situation in their provinces. Especially in provinces with just 2 settlements. Because you can get up to minus 20 growth. And let's say you have 2 settlements tier 1, that's just 10 growth. Or even if they're tier 2, that's 14 growth. Like in this particular case, I have 15. So it is theoretically possible for all the growth I might get from the main settlement buildings until I get Karazak to tier 2, it is very possible for the growth I have from the main settlement buildings, which is the main driver of growth for virtually every race in the game, to like that growth to nullify itself with the level of control. This is why grudges are important, because grudges give you control. This is why High King Authority is so important, because it gives you a bit of control, and it helps at least keep this even. Even if you're not going to necessarily go very high on the control level, where you could, get that 25 growth, at least you won't do so early on. And this is a problem. It's an issue, especially early on in a campaign. It's not necessarily as much of an issue later on in a campaign, but it's certainly a major problem early on when you're starting at the Dwarves. And early game aggression, taking a lot of territory as quickly as possible, is how Warhammer 3 works. It's what separates the stronger races from the weaker races, because the stronger races excel at this playstyle. Now, it is a map design issue rather than a racial issue. I've spent a lot of time talking about the races, but really it's the way that Creative Assembly has designed a map that pushes the meta in that direction. If you want the meta changed, you need a different map. That is the simple reality of things. Then, because we're not finished, the actual playstyle of the Dwarves, like the Dwarves can get a powerful army, except they have one of the weakest and most pathetic casualty replenishment systems in the game. The only one I think is genuinely worse is Kairos Fateweaver. Not Siege as a whole, because you have the Changeling as part of Siege, but it's Siege. Like, the Dwarves are only slightly better than Siege, and Siege is terrible because I think it's the way the barriers work with regards to casualty replenishment. So you need more, I think, if you're playing as Siege. But the problem is, with the Dwarves, you don't really have a way of improving casualty replenishment. You can get the Parley Field, but that's a growth building. That's not a casualty replenishment building. It can give you 3%. 3% is insignificant. There's a mod that gives you a craftable dwarf replenishment. I'm not sure if I have it active right now in this particular situation. I may not, or I may be looking at the wrong thing. Okay, so there's a mod that gives you plus 14 for 200 of gold, so you can make that decision. But relying on mods to fix these issues, this is really the frustrating thing. There's so many problems with dwarves that are easily fixable with these kind of mods, like Unforgotten Dwarves, craftable dwarf replenishment, and so on and so forth. There isn't a mod, I think, that increases income from looting and sacking settlements for the dwarves, and they will end up being limited with respect to that. Now, another problem for this is they have that weak casualty replenishment. They have really no way to improve it. So that means you're going to be forced to fight a significant number of battles manually, and they'll end up being pretty damn boring. The grind is real for dwarves. Resolving battles is probably one of the most surefire ways of losing a campaign as the dwarves in a quick possible fashion. Grumbrindle is the exception here with casualty replenishment because he can get up to 6% faction-wide. It's not quite even the level of Cafe, but it is decent enough that he can make work. That's why Grumbrindle has the best dwarf in the campaign. Furthermore, and this is where it really becomes awful to play the dwarves. The only army that's worth using as dwarves is a Quarreler Grudge Thrower army. Early on. Later on, you might vary it a bit, but basically, here's how you recruit as the dwarves. When you start with the tier 1 settlement, as I did, you recruit dwarf warriors. Regular dwarf warriors don't recruit dwarf warriors with great weapons because they'll take more damage in battles, and in particular auto-resolve. But a couple of dwarf warriors and miners with blasting charges for their AoE capability. You can get some dwarf warriors with great weapons, but they're just going to take more damage, in particular for range, because they don't have those shielded units. But once you get to tier 2 barracks, you only recruit exclusively Quarrelers and Quarrelers with great weapons. You vary it out depending on what you're facing. I generally get the balance between the two of them. Quarrelers with great weapons are better against melee units. the regular ones are just better against ranged units because they have that bronze shield. And there's literally no reason to ever recruit dwarf warriors again in a campaign. The reason behind that is you might think, oh, I can get a couple of cheap dwarf warriors to help with flank protections. That's not too bad. Except that the way that auto-resolve works, if you have an army with say 4 melee units and the rest ranged and artillery, those melee units are going to be punished severely. Now maybe you don't care because hey, you can always replace those dwarf warriors. Fair enough argument, but you'll end up taking significantly more damage. Whereas an army purely made up of quarrelers and artillery will do substantially better. And the aspect of melee units taking a lot of damage if there's only a handful of them does apply to other melee units as well. Hammers, iron breakers, longbeards. That is the same situation they have to deal with as well. So you get quarrelers and you get grudge throwers. You do have the advantage of being able to recruit grudge throwers at tier 2, so that's great. Bolt throwers are not worth ever even considering that they exist. Later on, the only variety you might have in a campaign, the only variety you should probably go for, would be to get cannons, maybe some thunderers, 1 or 2 units, some iron drakes maybe, but you might get some variety over here through these units, but specifically you would get, what I'd recommend is probably 2 iron drakes. Thunderers are not great in a lot of situations. They can do a decent amount of damage, but they have those line of sight issues that the quarrelers don't have, shockingly enough. And you may want to get some organ guns and great cannons. Cannons for dealing with walls, organ guns for field battle. And that is all the variety in armies that you might go for as the dwarves. Iron breakers are pretty strong line holders, but they're also an expensive unit in a situation where you will have problems maintaining a lot of armies in a campaign as the dwarves. So probably not worth really investing in, except much later on in the campaign. Hammers, absolutely not worth recruiting. Gyrocopters, gyrobombers, not worth recruiting at all. And then you need special buildings in order to recruit things like Thanes, Runesmith, and yeah, you need to get buildings that you have basically no other purpose for, well, with the exception of the armory, which increases local recruitment capacity, but you have no, you don't really have much of a reason to bother with things like the engineer workshop, with the exception of increasing the hero capacity for master engineers, which happens at tier 4. At least you can get a bunch of runesmiths in your campaign because they only require a tier 3 settlement. By the way, requiring a tier 4 settlement to increase hero capacity for certain heroes is particularly awful for a race that has such horrible growth as the dwarves. And that's another problem that the dwarves do have to deal with. And look, many of these things, as I stated, recruitment capacity, casualty replenishment, the research tree, etc. Well, you can research things a lot faster than I indicated in this video because you can get students and archivists through post-battle. But that's also an annoying system because what you do at the beginning of every turn, you pause whatever you're researching, you fight whichever battles, and you have a chance of getting an ancillary called a student, which can only be applied to heroes in your army, or you can get archivists, which work for both heroes and lords. So you can vastly increase your research rate if you do something like that. But a lot of these issues, the problems the dwarves do have, can be fixed with mods. By doing things like Creative Assembly really needs to add genuine variety in their campaigns, better systems in their campaigns, and more exciting systems to deal with. Because ultimately, even if the dwarves aren't so horrible to play, even with better growth, better economy, better casualty replenishment, more recruitment capacity, they're honestly just boring to play. They don't have a variety of armies that you use, and you don't get the excitement that you do have, like, say, in a Elven campaign. Yeah, you can spice things up in a high Elven campaign because you'll be able, 1, to afford it, and 2, you have things like magic, you have different heroes to use, and while the archer light armor spam certainly is the best way to do things, you also get a bunch of melee units that you can use in high Elven campaigns that are actually worth using, unlike the melee units of the dwarves. When elves are better in terms of their melee roster, let alone, the cavalry situation that elves do have, or the chariot situation that elves do have, or the freaking dragon situation that elves do have. Kind of sad state of affairs for the dwarves in their campaigns. So it ends up being a fairly boring playstyle that you do have. A lot of things can be improved with mods, and the dwarves certainly can be a very playable race, but right now it's just a very outdated design. Chaos dwarves are just much more fun to play at the moment. Like if you want to play a dwarven campaign, it's like Chaos dwarves are night and day better in every way than what the dwarves have to offer. More interesting army roster, better economy, better campaign systems, better recruitment, better casualty replenishment, just a lot more fun. Because Chaos Dwarves were designed for this map, whereas every other race has to deal with this particular map design that they have chosen. Questine here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.